The journey is conversations with ordinary people about stories of transformation and how we may have had setbacks in our life and how we persevered through those, how we've learned from those obstacles, and how they've maybe helped us on our path today. So, Mary Kay Morrison, welcome to The Journey. And The Journey is just a talk show, podcast about transformation and how individuals throughout their life have either reconstructed their life, have failed forward, have found themselves with some type of obstacle in their way, and how they work through that, and on the other side of it, how then, because of what they learned, they were able to maybe share with others some of the things that some of the gold that they got out of that experience. And so, welcome to The Journey. I know we met in person the first time probably about a month ago.
Right.
And I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and it was a lot of fun, and we'll get into that here probably in a little bit. But so, Mary Kay, tell us a little bit about what do you do for fun? When you have a chance, because you're a really busy lady, when you have a chance to relax, what do you do for fun? What do you do to re-energize yourself?
Well, I think I told you I'm a real swinger.
Mm-hmm, yes.
I have 3 swings in my backyard.
Yeah.
And so in the summer, I really enjoy getting out there and relaxing. I've got 3 different kinds. I find it's good exercise.
Okay.
And it helps me to escape into nature. And it's playful.
Okay.
And I love play.
Sure.
So I try to incorporate play into my life as often as I can for relaxation and fun. And because I believe it's the way we learn and grow.
Sure. So when you think of, when you go back to swings, when was your first experience? What do you remember first being on a swing? When first exposed to being a swing?
My dad built a swing set for our backyard.
Okay.
And it was made out of, I think, PCB pipe or something like that when it went up and around.
Okay.
And it was, he put it together himself, and I used to shimmy up the top, and the pipe was about that big, and I would hang from the top and then slither down the swing.
Okay.
And but I loved swinging and climbing trees.
Sure. Okay.
And so forth. So it was that was my first swing experience. Okay. But I've always enjoyed the motion of it and the freedom that I feel when I'm on a swing.
Okay. Now, did you grow up around the Rockford area? Or?
No, I grew up in Peoria.
Okay. All right. And so you grew up in Peoria and go to high school there as well? And
I did.
And then life as it happened, then where'd you move from Peoria to, it wasn't directly to Rockford though?
No, I lived in DeKalb for quite a few years. Actually, my first teaching job was in South Streeter, Illinois. I was a kindergarten teacher.
Okay. All right.
And loved it. And I worked with high poverty kids.
Okay.
At that time, I had 30 kids in the morning and 30 in the afternoon.
Okay.
And there were no support services. It was a very small school. And I learned a lot that year, including don't put all the puzzles out at one time because you'll spend a couple hours at night putting them all back together again.
Trying to figure out all the pieces, sure.
So, but I love teaching kindergarten. And I think I told you that one of my frustrations was, as I went along in my career in education, there were a lot of mandates that came down from the state, including testing mandates. And my background was early childhood education, and I'm a firm believer in the power of play and laughter and fun as a way to learn and grow. So I was told that I needed to test these kids, 5-year-olds, with pencils and paper, and a lot of them were not able to do that successfully. So it was very frustrating. And even within our school, this was a ways back in time, under No Child Left Behind, but we had to mail the tests into the state. And one of the teachers was so upset with the process, and one of the kids was so upset that they threw up on the test, and she mailed the test that way as a protest. So there were a lot of us that were very frustrated at that time about taking time away from kids' development in the area that we knew was beneficial, and forcing them to sit in their desks and study ABCs, for instance, or do paper and pencil work, which we know today is very adversarial to learning.
Sure. So there's an interesting, just for the people who are listening, just to get a little bit about your background. So you've been an educator for how long?
50 years.
50 years, okay. And your first, right out of college, your first position was a teacher, and that was the kindergarten teacher. Okay. And when you did your field placement or a student teaching assignment, was that in the grade school as well?
Right. And I've ended up teaching at every level.
Every level, okay.
Right. Went back and got my master's in adult education, elementary education, and administration. Okay. So I kept going back to school.
Sure, okay.
I love being a student as well as a teacher. So I think teaching is learning. Sure. You know, you always feel like you learn more than the kids do.
Sure, and I know I can, every time I do a workshop or do a seminar, or even when I'm working with my clients, it's very much that, you know, the more that, I don't think you can teach it. To teach it means you have to have a level of knowing it, right? And then, but even in that interaction of the workshop or the interaction of the group, I know for me, almost all the time I walk away with learning something that I didn't know.
Exactly.
So it's a lot about that back and forth, the preparation beforehand, but then the experience of doing it, I get so much out of that for myself as well. So I'm curious about this idea of the tension between obviously there's a level of importance of learning certain skills, fundamental developmental skills, at those early grade school level, so that then we can build on other skills later on. And so I think there's this belief that, well, you have to do it by doing the rows and memorization and regurgitation and that element of it, but your experience shows that you can do both. So tell us a little bit about your experience with that, because that seemed, at least that was my experience as a school social worker, that was a lot of the emphasis was on memorization and certain techniques that could be used, but it was a lot about standardized testing,
right.
And that would be how you measured if you had learned certain skills.
Right.
But you've lived a little, that there's a different way of doing that. So tell us a little bit about, first, the whole experience of living in that tension, because there's a lot of pressure, and was back then, there is now for that. So tell us a little bit about that.
I love that question, because I really do believe in accountability. But when we talk about learning, there's a standardized curriculum, which is the content. And I've actually got a couple of graphics in my book that I wrote, Using Humor to Maximize Learning. But we talk about content, and that's what we want kids to know and be able to do. Mm-hmm. But then surrounding that is the process of how do you teach. And there are many methods for teaching depending on your personality and what you bring to the kids that you teach. So every one of us brings different skills and strengths. And so we teach from our strengths, I think. Outside of that is where you teach. That also impacts the learning process. So if you're in a high poverty school, for instance, a lot of times, historically, those schools have not had the supplies and the resources that schools have had in wealthier suburbs, for instance. And then the other piece that I think is critically important, and why I talk so much about play and laughter and fun and the playfulness, is the emotions that you bring and the students bring to the classroom, because that's the dynamic that happens within the classroom, is the interaction between all of the students and the adults that are in the classroom. And so good teachers know this. They know they need to teach the content, and they are obviously aware of the process that they like to use. And there's a gazillion different processes that teachers can choose from. And the environment impacts it as well. But if you have a child that comes to school that's angry or depressed or upset or hungry, all of that impacts their learning. And that's not something we focus a whole lot on in education. One of the things that we know that good teachers automatically do is they meet the needs of those children before they start the learning process. So if they have a child that's coming to school and they know that kid's angry, they're going to do whatever they can to change that child's state. That's not something we really teach in curriculum necessarily in colleges, but it's something that I've become passionate about, is that how do we change that emotional state of a child that's in the classroom, and also the teachers, because a teacher that's coming to the classroom that's angry about the mandates, or like I was, and I've learned from that experience that I was very frustrated with the process of having to have kids learn how to take a test at that age. So I think there's a lot of components that are going on, but I feel like the most important thing is the emotional interactions that occur within the classroom. The number one thing that kids need, I think, today, in order to learn at an optimal level, is to be able to feel powerful and good and know that they can do it. And that's what good teachers instill in their students, as well as coaches and social workers and all of the other people that interact with their students, the students during the day.
So a lot of times someone may be listening to this, right? And they, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's someone else, and they'll go, okay, so I heard what Mary Kay said, and I want them to feel good about themselves. I want them to know that they can do something, right? Whatever it may be, whatever the task may be, is based upon their age level. And so then they become their child's cheerleader, and maybe that they tell them that they're great, they can do these types of things. But what if they haven't actually done those things, or haven't actually developed a skill with it? From a coaching standpoint, back when I was a football coach and in the weight room, there was times when people would come in and they would be ready to go, and they would be very confident, or at least they came across as being very confident. But when they came in, they had not necessarily been exposed to some of the things, either with that sport or in the weight room. How does play help actually build real confidence, not a false sense of confidence?
I'm not sure that play in as of itself builds that confidence, although it probably does. Let me think about that a second. As human beings, we have the longest period of play of any mammal. So the longer the period of play of any animal that there is, the higher their level of intelligence. And so human beings have a longer period of play. If that period of play is disrupted, or if children don't have that time that is allotted for them to learn through play, their capacity for learning can be inhibited. So I'm not necessarily saying that that you infuse play into the classroom, so to speak, but there should be a playfulness about the situation and opportunities for kids to learn in a whole variety of ways that include activities that are fun and engaging. So the word play and engaging, I think, maybe need to be clarified a little bit.
Okay.
So the goal is to be have kids be engaged, and play is a way to do that. But early on, for young kids, play is a way for them to learn and to grow and to maximize their capacity for learning. However, it's also been shown that adults are more productive when they play. So a lot of times when I started doing workshops, one of the things that I learned immediately was that if I would do a workshop for teachers, and there were elementary teachers there as well as high school teachers, that a lot of times the high school teachers would have a different focus or would feel like their students don't have time to play. But I think that incorporating play, imagination, wonder, spontaneity are all important elements for people to really think outside the box and to be creative. Am I answering your question?
No, it is. I had an experience, and I'm drawing a blank right now. It was last summer, and it was a couple of ladies who got trained, and it was regarding a certification in free play, and essentially about being able to provide opportunities for free play outside. And there was an element when I went and observed this. They were in the woods, and they had there was no there were some overall guidelines regarding safety and those types of things, but there wasn't necessarily any rules or any expectations, except that they had a given amount of time and whatever, that they could create whatever. And I remember observing that, and that reminded me of when I was younger, in playing, when I was in grade school, and we would go out, and I happened to grow up in a new subdivision. We were one of the first homes in that subdivision that moved into that area of the subdivision, and it was great as a kid. The weeds, the weeds were like taller. I don't know how tall they were, but it seemed like they were 6 foot tall, and we could build trails and take wood and different scrap from the scrap where the construction site was, and we would build these forts or build these structures or whatever, and it felt like we were doing it for endless hours of creating these things. And whoever the neighbors were, you were collaborating together and working together, and we would do this forever. It seemed like, and we'd have different go off into the woods and just follow the creek to the state park, and that's a lot of my memories growing up, as well as some memories that I had growing up on my grandparents' farm, and where, of course, there were certain things that we had to be respectful regarding safety, because there was a lot of dangerous things that were on the farm, but at the same time, I never remember being micromanaged. I think now back going, what were my parents thinking? That I'd be gone for hours at a time, and no one, as far as I knew, they didn't know where I was. They just knew when to come back, come back into the house. And I have a lot of fond memories of that. And then when my kids grew up, I don't know as a parent how I became so fearful of my kids. Now, maybe it had to do with the house. The very first house that we had was a very busy street, and it wouldn't have been safe for them to play in the front yard. We were there for like 4 years, and we had the mailbox taken out like 4 or 5 times. So it was literally not safe to be in this particular road. But and maybe it started there, this fearfulness that I had about needing to monitor there when they were outside playing. But I don't remember that was my parents' experience or my experience growing up with my parents. So that's why I guess what I was just curious about, that level of. There was a certain level of things that I remember learning from putting things together, to creativity, to, I guess, looking back at it now, leadership. There was different things that I remember during that time period, but it was all just in the sake of playing.
You're absolutely right. You were a free-range kid, is what we called them.
Sure.
And we've lost a lot of that today because parents are fearful. And there's also two things going on, I think. One is media has shared and exasperated fear because we hear about kids being kidnapped and about kids getting hurt in different situations. And so parents want to protect their kids, which is awesome and should be. But the other thing that's occurred is there's a real push. We were talking about sports earlier. In order for kids to excel or to get into the college that their parents want them to get into, as a society, we are really pushing our children, and they are programmed from the minute they get up until the time they go to bed. They're in lessons. They're in, all kinds of different groups, and pushed in school so that the kids are doing homework and they don't have time for the free range kind of thing that you were fortunate to experience. And I was too as a kid. We went out in the alley and played kick the can, and rocks and gravel, and I know I had pebbles in my knees a lot of times from flying through the air and landing on the gravel. But today we have built a protective bubble around our children, and I'm advocating that we give kids a little more free range. And what you were talking about in the forest is what we really like to see teachers do in the classroom, is set up opportunities for kids to explore and to tinker and to create. And when you think about some of the great minds of today, for instance, the people that developed, in their garage, the origins of what we have now as our little phones that we hold in our hands. And that was developed tinkering in garages. And Google today has playrooms. McDonald's has playrooms. So they let their engineers and their inventors have some free range of exploring and inventing. And why are we taking that away from our kids in schools? In other words, set up the environment so children have the opportunity to learn the content, which is important, but the process can be play activated or shared through experimentation, and giving them the materials and letting them figure out how to develop and to grow that way. So the content is still the same, and so you have the idea that you still want them to learn that content, but the process can include a lot of play, a lot of engagement, a lot of giving children challenges, and say, this is where, this is the what we would like you to think about, and how are you going to get there, and having them engage as a group instead of sitting in a desk by themselves, but teaming them up with other people so they can explore together. Like we hope in the workplace today that people will engage in conversations between themselves and come up with ideas and generate and increase productivity in the business wherever they are. So we've lost a lot of that in schools when we're having kids sit in desks and do paper and pencil work. It can even be brought. My favorite activity was I was very fortunate. I worked at the Regional Office of Education here in Boone, Winnebago County, and I had the opportunity to be in visit with teachers from over 200 schools. And I learned a lot from those teachers about how they were setting up their classrooms and how they were teaching. And I brought humor. My workshops were on using humor to reduce stress and to bring play to the classroom. So I did a lot of those workshops. And Dr. Fairgraves, who was an amazing boss, and one day I went to him and I said, these teachers are really stressed. Can I have a workshop on how to use humor and play and fun to reduce the stress in the classroom along with the kids? And he said, sure. So I started working on the brain and how we learn, and I was able to go to a lot of workshops on the brain and learning. And I learned more about play and about how we can interact and how our brains learn best. And lecture is actually the worst way that we learn. After 10 minutes, the brain goes to sleep.
Okay.
So the interactive, the engagement is so critically important. And how can you have fun with your kids when you're teaching and learning, or whatever you do, when you're coaching, or as a social worker? We know that kids will relax. That angry child, if you can get them to laugh, then anger will dissipate.
So I'm gonna go back a little bit just to hear a little bit about this part of it, and because I get a sense that you innately knew this, but you had, as you said, you were coming up against resistance. So one, what was the reason you wanted to become an educator? How did that all come about? And then this whole idea, this commitment to using humor, using play. So first, tell us about why become an educator. What was that? What was the reason why you wanted to become an educator?
Oh, when I was a kid, I'm the oldest of 7, so I always played teacher.
Sure. Okay.
And I like to have fun with the kids. I mean, it was just fun. And kindergarten was just a lot of fun. You never know what to expect with kindergarten kids. And actually, you don't in any level of interaction. So, I was thrilled to be a teacher. And I think teaching is an amazing occupation. Teachers are stressed today, very stressed. I have a daughter who's teaching, 7th grade science, in a high-poverty school. And so I'm listening to her several times a week, talking about the challenges that we have today in education. For instance, why are we in schools doing cookie sales to raise money for books, for the library, when businesses and industry really can go out and they don't have to do it that way? They can get the funding. So funding is an important, critical part of education. I really feel like we need to think about how we fund education and think about how we focus our teachers and give our teachers the support that we need. I am veering way off from the question you asked. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
But you asked me how and why I think education is important. I think it's the foundation for what we do as a society, and it's critically important. And let me ask you, do you think humor is important?
I think for me, as a counselor, it is very much part of that initial interview, initial time when I meet. And again, it depends on the person, depends on what's going on. I think there's a way of being playful or being more lighthearted. It's already serious enough. If you're coming to counseling, it's already serious enough. If you're going to a workshop on whatever it may be, it's already serious enough. And so if there can be a little bit of lightness, that seems to break some of that tension, because in the counseling world, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear around first coming in. I mean, it's a pretty unnatural process,
right,
to come in and talk about stuff that I wouldn't normally talk about to people that I do know. Now I need to talk to it about someone that I don't know. I think there is that element that, so that for me, I think that is a way of kind of breaking some of that initial tension. Just recently, I was had the honor and opportunity to officiate my nephew's wedding, and I didn't realize at the time that I must have been a little bit more nervous than I thought I was, right? And the reason why I say that is because I practiced so much beforehand. There was parts that I had to memorize of it, even though I was reading it, and that's not my normal style of teaching. So as we were coming down, the bride and her father were coming down, and there was this part in it where I was supposed to say, who gives this woman to this man, right? And as they were coming down, everyone was nervous, and because the spotlight was on them. And the night before, I practiced it perfect. Everything went fine, and I go out and I start, who gives this man to give to this other man? Or I don't even know how I said it, and everyone started laughing. I said, well, I guess the tensions broke now. And there was this, element of everyone was a little bit more at ease. Now, I would love to say that I was a genius and I planned that. That was not the case. I didn't plan it. It just happened. It was probably the right thing. It wasn't necessarily planned. It was the perfect thing to happen, I should say, even though it wasn't a planned thing that happened. But again, there was an element of humor in it because it was such a serious moment, and that seriousness was almost taking away from the authenticity of that moment. And so for me, I definitely believe that humor is part of that. And I know we were talking earlier about how because some people are very serious, and there's different reasons why they may be very serious, and it goes to that blueprint of when they were growing up. What was their experience like growing up when it came to play, when it came to being playful, or just humor in general? And so maybe talk a little bit about that piece of the essence of how, because some people in your workshop would go and conceptually they get it, but this is work, and it can't be fun or funny. It's serious, and I have images in my mind of certain instructors that I had in the past that were very serious about the topic they were teaching because it was a very important topic to them, and it just made it extremely boring. Right. For me, at least, it made it boring for me. So maybe touch base a little bit about for some people it may be easier. Exactly. And it may be more natural, maybe not easier, maybe more natural. They're more familiar with using humor or using play or playfulness when interacting, either with their own kids or grandkids, or in the workplace.
A lot of questions here, lots to cover. But I think you've touched on several things, Kevin. Everybody says humor is important, so I asked you if you thought humor was important, and you talked about how it relieved the seriousness of a situation where you were a little bit tense. One of the things that we know is I've never met anybody that says it's not important. Sure. But we don't study it, we don't practice it, and we don't promote it. So I really feel like one of my passions is I'm past president of the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor, and that's what we do. Our mission is to study, practice, and promote healthy humor and laughter. And so I've been studying humor and laughter for about the past 20 years. Okay. And one of the things that when I do workshops is we talk about how you develop your sense of humor, whether it's nature or nurture, which is what you were talking about earlier. And that does impact your humor style. So people have different humor styles, what they're more comfortable with as far as how they use humor. But also, if you grew up with parents who did not like humor or value it, who were very work-oriented, and who, when you were playing, either inhibited it or got angry with you about playing or not working, it's harder for you to really nurture your own sense of humor. I think everybody has the capacity for using humor and enjoying life through humor and play. But it's more difficult for people if they've been programmed to be a workaholic, for instance. So depending on how you grew up, your nature, your temperament plays a huge role. So when you look at your kids, I've got 4 children, and they all had different personalities, believe it or not.
Sure, yeah.
And so there's a great book called Your Temperament Perspective. And some kids are actually born laughing, and other kids are born more serious. So your temperament plays a role in your sense of humor. And your parents, of course, or your significant others play a huge role in that. So I ask people to think about, how did you grow up? And how do you feel when you play? So my father was always playful and having a good time and joking and laughing. And my mother was much more serious. And so when I start doing playful and fun things, sometimes I hear my mother's voice in my head saying, you need to buckle down, you need to be serious. That voice is always there. And so how do you overcome, when you study the brain, and it's really fascinating now, because we used to, when I was learning about education, the only way we learned about behavior and about learning was from psychology studies. Today we have brain scans, and we have that technology. We also have cellular research that actually does examine what happens to your body physiologically when you're laughing, and what happens to your brain when you're laughing. And they're actually able to take pictures of people's brains when they're laughing and having humor. There's actually a lab school in Utah that takes a look at kids' brains when they're studying and learning, and what areas of the brain are lighting up. And let me put a quick plug in for our conference that we're having in May of this year, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor Conference. We have a neuroscientist coming who studies the brain and humor. So he studies what goes on in the brain when you're laughing and having fun. He's also a comedian.
Okay.
So he should be a lot of fun.
Sure.
So if people want more information, they can contact me. But let me go back to, I think that everyone has the capacity for improving their sense of humor. And they call that your humor practice.
Okay.
And it's like anything else. In order to get better at it, you have to practice it. And so I compare it to physical fitness. I want to be physically fit. In order to do that, I need to work out on a regular basis.
Sure.
So I ask people to observe their current sense of humor. How often did you laugh today? Journal about it. Write about it. At night, journal about what made you laugh during the day. And for people that are in the business, you can learn a whole lot more about humor therapy, which is we have some psychologists that are actually using humor therapy in their practice now, using humor to help people get through anger and grief. Several of the people in our organization are actually dealing with humor and grief, and how once you're able to laugh about something, you're starting to heal. And so
Cool.
I just want to go quickly about the brain and what happens in the brain. For instance, if you grew up with parents or someone who, I give the example that I grew up with 5 brothers, so my mother made a cake every day. So my neural pathways in my brain are hardwired for sweet. And a lot of people, I think, have that. And I'm really trying hard to make it broccoli. Mm-hmm. And so those patterns of behavior in the brain, if you have anger about something, that can be a pretty strong pathway in your brain. And one way to change that pathway is to try to include more humor into your life when you're going through those feelings. So breaking and changing those neural pathways in your brain, interjecting play, interjecting humor, fun, as a way to change those patterns.
So you had said something interesting before, and I guess that's maybe where, I'm thinking about some of the people that are listening to us. So some of them may be educators, some of them may be counselors, some of them may be working in just workplace, whatever it may be. I was doing some consulting work for a company. It's changed multiple times right now, but at the time it was called United Technology, or used to be called Sunstrand, and I think it's called Collins now. And but it was aerospace industry, and we were looking at there was at that time there was a lot of tension between management and the labor force for a handful of different reasons, and so the culture in itself, I guess for a lack of better words, may have been toxic at the time. But there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of fear that was going on both sides. And then, of course, it seemed to be put toward them. And I remember the individual that I was working with at the time, Steve Sipe, he and I did some research, and we did research on Pike's Place Fish Market.
Yes.
Out in Seattle.
They have a whole program.
Yes.
And one of their tenants is play.
Yeah, and that was they became famous, right?
Yeah.
Because it was a fish market, and they would throw fish,
right,
and used a lot of humor when they were interacting with the customers.
Exactly.
And I think it was the combination. I mean, in itself, the idea that they were throwing fish and catching the fish, right? But it was probably as much to do with the humor part of it, right? And the playfulness that was going on. I mean, how could you be throwing fish at this, kind of a drab? It was a fish market. I mean, everything from the smells to the mess to everything, right? And I remember at that time looking at this idea, and clearly they were having fun. Clearly it was part of doing allowed that as the work became more and more difficult, or looking forward to going to work, especially during difficult, the idea that this culture of play, this was the expectation. This is what we're going to do. We're going to engage the customer. It seemed like it was a perfect fit for what we're talking about. But we were working in the aerospace industry. What were we going to throw? Airplane parts? I mean, what were we? So I remember Steve and I wrestling with this idea. It didn't have to do with throwing fish. That was just what they happened to be doing. Was what they did in their particular industry. But it was about that playfulness.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about how do you incorporate this concept into, if it's the grandparent who is picking the kids up from school, or bringing them to school, whatever, or if it's you're working at a gas station as a gas station attendant, or you're whatever the industry may be, how would we incorporate more of a sense of play in our work first? Because I think we have to first do it with ourselves before we can do it with someone else.
It helps to have a humor buddy.
Sure.
And one of my humor buddies who helped me found the Humor Academy, which is a 3-year program. You end up with a certified humor professional designation. So if anybody's interested in learning more about this topic, we have the program for you. But you're exactly right. The whole idea of playfulness and incorporating that into your workplace, Karen and I talk often about, and she has coined the phrase, it's not about being funny, it's about seeing funny.
Seeing funny.
Seeing funny.
Okay.
So whatever it is that you're looking at in life, if you can flip it and make it fun and funny. And we have people in the association who are dealing with hospice, who are dealing with grieving people, who are helping them to see funny. Several of them are authors and have written about their transformational journey, about how do you see funny with whatever it is you've been dealt with. And so I love that Karen came up with that phrase, because when I tell people I do humor, they say, "You do what?" And then they say, "Tell me a joke, make me laugh."
Sure.
And that's not what it's about. It's about actually trying to bring more joy and laughter into your life. And again, once you're able to laugh about something, if you look at funerals, if you look at obituaries, actually it's very interesting to read obituaries. I think 1 out of 3 talk about a person's sense of humor. You know, but again, we don't study it, we don't practice it. And when you're at a funeral, a lot of times what happens is you're all grieving and you're very sad and serious until somebody starts telling funny stories or remembering people. And people laugh. Laughter and tears are very closely related. And once again, when you start laughing about something, or you're able to laugh, you know you're starting to heal. And I want to bring it back to schools again, because again, we have a lot of kids that are hurting in schools, kids that come to school that are in pain in one way or another. And so again, it's that ability of a teacher to use a process to inject something, a little teasing, a little recognition, a little ability to help that child through whatever it is, that a story, and to find some funny or some fun in their day so that they can laugh in the day somewhere along the line. One of my favorite stories, and I've been doing workshops for teachers for over 20 years now, studying the brain and humor, because it's not just injecting humor in the content and in the process and in the environment, but also in assessment, because you mentioned earlier, we need to know that people have those skills. And my favorite story is about a 7th grade teacher who told me that he had all of their students read the chapter in the book, and they had to design an assessment question using a riddle or joke. So every question on that assessment was a riddle or joke related to the history of the paragraph that student had to read. So the kids loved taking that test, that assessment. One of the assessments that I always do at the end of a workshop, because I like to see if people learned what I taught them during the time that I teach. I have a little plastic ball that I throw, and it has been more fun because I've done a lot of groups. I've worked in banks, I've worked with financial advisors, I've worked with people from all walks of life, because humor is universal. But I ask them to fill out an index card first. On the first side is aha, what did you learn today? On the second side is haha, what do you hope to do to improve your humor practice, taking this out into the world? And then I have a ball toss, and when they catch the ball, they have to tell either their aha or their haha. So what did they learn? Or what are they going to do as a result of what they did with me that day? So the assessment process is really interesting as well. And we can inject humor. In my book, I talk about hook, line, and sinker. And you talked about hooking people with humor, because a lot of people do that. They like to get people to laugh at the beginning of a workshop. But also the line, which is the actual material that people have to use or learn, and injecting humor along the way. And then using it in the assessment process. I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
I want to ask you, what is your very first memory of school? And so kindergarten, first grade, what's your very first memory?
It's more of a generalization. I remember I went to it was a huge building, and the kindergarten room was in the low, like a lower level, and I remember that there was a huge carpet, and there was a lot of toys, or they were all neatly put away and stuff, but I remember there was an element of playing there, and I remember interacting with those toys, and then I remember the playground of the playing on the playground. It reminded me a lot of. It was also very similar to when I went to church, and the nursery. That would play in, during church service or whatever. It was also pretty similar, and so I just remember that. And now as I'm thinking about it, there were some tables there that you would sit at, and
What emotion do you remember?
There was a contentness. There was an element of safety.
That's good.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't have that. When I do workshops, I usually get quite a few stories about fear and anger experiences. A lot of people do have some good experiences, like your experience sounds like it was good. Mm-hmm. But I've had stories of people. For instance, my story is I got put in the coat closet for talking too much. Mm-hmm. You find that hard to believe. And I was mad. It wasn't my fault. And I remember that.
Yeah,
it was the girl ahead of me.
Yeah,
she started it. Mm-hmm. So, that feeling of anger, and I've had a lot of people, and so that experience, strong emotions put information into the long-term memory. Mm-hmm. So yours was a safety and contentment. So your memory is pretty safe and content. But a lot of people's relay memories of being in a fight or getting hurt or being really scared.
Now, you asked me specifically about kindergarten. Now, if you would have asked me about later in grade school, then there would have been some of that later in grade school. But K through third grade, that was in Rockford, and I remember walking to school, as a small person, and when we moved out of the district and moved to a different district, it was different. It was a different experience, and the school was different, and maybe it was because I was a new kid to the school, but there was definitely more tension, more
anxiety, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, more. And the anxiety came because there were some kids. It was probably the first time I ran across kids that were mean kids. I wouldn't have used the word bullying back then because I didn't know that word then. But there was kids that were mean, and I had only experienced that once before. Growing up, and so now there were certain elements about school that wasn't safe.
One of my job experiences is I worked at a community college, and I worked with people in the GED program and the teen parent program before I was started at the regional office of education, and those people dropped out of school because usually of a really negative experience. They felt dumb. They did not have success in school. And the reason they dropped out, and one of my aha moments was a man who came in and said his son was having trouble in school. And he started crying and said, "My son is as dumb as I was." Mm. And it's not that they were dumb, but their schools were not designed for their type of learning necessarily. And we're learning a whole lot more about that today. Mm. And that's why the whole idea of designing rooms so that kids have opportunities to make choices. Choice is extremely important in that process of teaching, that teachers give students a choice in how they're going to learn.
Well, what's interesting for me as a social worker, and specifically a school social worker, is that having those choices, I would think, and I didn't think about this until right now, is that having those choices would then allow the teacher to then assess what is this particular child's or student's learning style, yes, and then teaching them to their learning style, yes, versus trying to have everyone have the same learning style.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. But I'm not aware of what what teachers or even part of the curriculum are they looking at learning style? And so if there's a mismatch between learning style and the teaching style, then there is going to be that sense of I'm less than, compared to the person that is being taught to their learning style.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's another whole topic.
Sure, yeah. One of the things that, just recently Dalton and I were talking about this, and he's a wrestling coach, and his primary thing is wrestling, and in wrestling, it's a tough sport. I mean, and there's a lot of hard work that comes with it. But I remember him talking about this idea of, do you like to wrestle? Are you, I don't know if he used the word fun or not, but, is it, do you want to wrestle? Do you like wrestling? Or is it just about the outcome aspect of it? And there needs to be this element that if we're going to be doing something, that we have to figure out how to make it fun, right? That doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard work. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be serious and that we're not going to, need to put in the diligence to learn the skills. But is it fun? Is it enjoyable to do? And, a month ago when we met, that was probably what stood out to me, was this idea, like, I believe for my therapist that work for me at KP, is that I need them to do their work on themselves so that they can be available for when their clients come in. I need them to be able to enjoy what they're doing, regardless if it's the therapist or the front desk staff or the person answering the phone, that I want them to enjoy not only the environment, but enjoy what they're doing, because then it's a whole lot easier for them to do what they have what's expected of them regarding work. And I think of, this idea of finding the joy in whatever activity it is, because I think there's that misnomer about humor, right? This idea of humor is like a Robin Williams or some type of stand-up comedian. And maybe if it was like Robin Williams, so I think that even though he struggled with a lot of different things throughout his life, it's according to what I've understood, I think he saw the world through that lens of how to play. I don't think he accidentally played characters like Patch Adams. I don't think those were accidents. I think those were natural extension of who he is and who he was. And I think of that when I think of some of the things that you're inviting people into doing, is to find the joy. You use the word humor, you use the word play, but find the joy in who they are and what they're doing. And for some of us, we may need the intellectual and the educational background so that we can be convinced to allow ourselves to go into that process. Others of us may just naturally go, oh, we're just getting permission now to do it. And
I've had a lot of people tell me that.
or maybe now I have something to back me up so I won't get chastised anymore for doing it. But I think, in all those different things, I think inviting people into this process of finding joy in their life, and being joyous in what they do through play, even when maybe they're an accountant or because I agree with you, when I go to the schools and I talk to the students about bullying or suicide, or the factors that lead to suicide, the tension's pretty high, especially if they've lost a fellow student as a result of that. But I will definitely, I know that the stories that are probably remembered the most are the ones that have some level of playfulness tied to it. So I definitely appreciate everything that you're doing. Can you just give us a couple minutes about the Academy of Humor that you're talking about?
I'd love to.
And just maybe give us like 2 minutes of that.
About 10 years ago, I worked with several people in the organization, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor, on the need to educate people about what humor and laughter and play are. And again, playfulness and play lead to humor. So we decided to start a humor academy. I had been doing workshops at the regional office on humor and laughter and play, and the ability to combat stress, and had written my first book, Using Humor to Maximize Learning. So that was used as the text for the first class. The classes are through the organization, and they are yearly. So they begin at the conference. So if someone is interested in becoming a certified humor professional, it's a 3-year program, and it starts May 14th this year in New Orleans. And so you're put into a group. It's a study group, but it's also a support group, people supporting each other in the practice of humor. And they meet once a month via Zoom, and they talk about the text and how they're incorporating humor into their lives. First year is theory, which follows our mission to study. The second year is practice, and they do a project based on humor. And we have got projects from all realms of life. Grief. One woman has done healing headbands for kids that have cancer. And so the second year is of study, and again, you're meeting with a group each month and learning about humor. So the second year is practice, and the third year is leadership, is how do you share that in your field of practice? For instance, in your field, how would you incorporate humor, therapy humor, into your practice, into the culture, which I commend you for recognizing that you want a culture of play and laughter and relaxation, because that will enable everybody in the office to do a much better job and be more productive. So the conference is a 4-day conference, and students that enroll in the Humor Academy, and we have people from all walks of life, doctors, lawyers, psychologists, financial advisors, a lot of social workers, nurses, educators. So the fun part is that humor is universal. It applies to everybody, and I think everybody can improve their sense of humor and enjoy life more and have more fun. So,
well, perfect, Mary Kay. As we're getting ready to wrap up for today, if there was one thing that you would want to share with the people that are listening, what's one thing you'd want them to walk away with for our conversation today?
Try to see funny today.
Okay. All right. Perfect. The best way for people to get a hold of you if they want to learn more about either the Academy or just follow you, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
I'm on all social media.
Okay.
Mary Kay Morrison. I have Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook accounts. And Mary Kay at Quest for Humor is my email.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for being here. And I know you have a busy weekend coming up and a busy week this week with some speaking engagements. So
I do.
Have fun with that.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us today and listening to Mary Kay Morrison as she shared about how humor and playfulness and just the use of play to help in the learning process as well as finding joy in her life as well as others. Thank you for being with us today, and look forward to being with you next week.